Hello, and welcome to the Alexander Society. I'm your host, homesick, drafty GI Derek, joined by my friend and co-host, the voice in the trees that's speaking Vietnamese, Tim. How you doing, Tim?
I'm doing pretty good. Unfortunately, I don't know what I'm saying, so there's always that.
I'm pretty sure. Have you ever tried to read or listen to somebody speaking Vietnamese?
No.
I feel so stupid. I feel so stupid listening to people speak Vietnamese. I feel like a dog trying to understand English. It is such a complicated language. It's incredible.
It's insane. So how are you doing, Derek?
Oh, I'm doing all right. Nothing to report back home about. How are you doing, Tim?
Another day, another dollar, growing stronger, growing better.
Yeah. It's not a lot going on right now, I guess.
Yeah, not a whole lot. So, Derek, what are you drinking tonight?
So for my shooter, I'm pulling out the stuff I had in our last recording. It's the Lunazol El Humoso Smoked Blanco Tequila, 40%. Very. Now here's the thing. Here's the thing about this stuff. Okay, it is a high quality tequila. It is a good tequila. It is a very good tequila. But it's that smoke bit. It's the smoked bit. I don't know how I feel about it because after I take the shot and I get it down, I'm enjoying the taste while it's in my mouth, and then once it's down, all that's left is like campfire smoke in my mouth.
That sounds about like you.
It is crazy. I guess that appeals to some people, but for me, it's kind of crazy that somebody taste tested this when they were done. They're like, "Yep, that's a good use of agave."
Hey, people think mezcal's good, and I would rather die than drink mezcal.
Yeah, that's fair. So for my sipper, we've been doing a lot of Anthem recently, haven't we?
I did it last week, but I don't think we've done it a lot. Wait, no, I had Super Fancy. Yeah, we have done it at least a little bit.
Yeah, it keeps coming up because it's everywhere. I can literally walk into any grocery store, at least here in Oklahoma City. I can walk into any grocery store, any liquor store. They're going to have Anthem. It's everywhere, and it always looks good. It always ends up being good, so I'm not complaining, but I do kind of wish some of the stores I went to had a little more variety with their beer. I kind of have to pick where I go.
Oh, I do too.
But this is the Electric Light. It's a light lager. It's basically like Anthem dared to ask the radical question: what if Bud Light was good? And it turns out it's pretty good. Yeah. If it weren't for the fact that Budweiser is just now a soulless corporation, they might be able to make something good like this. So it's a 4.3, just a regular old-fashioned mom-and-pop light lager. It's not special, but it is really, really well done. So I'm always excited for that. Tim, what are you drinking?
So tonight I found that sold me solely on the can alone. It's got this gorgeous beach tropical scene with a toucan, trees, headphone hammock, girl in the headphone hammock, pineapples. It's dope. It's by Cabin Boys. It's called The Edge Sour Ale. It's a pineapple, pink guava, and blood orange. I personally think the blood orange is bringing everything down because it kind of mutes all the other flavors. It's a 6.2%. Oh, that's the reason. It's a pairing with the Edge Radio. Z104.5, The Edge. Didn't know that.
Oh, okay. I think breweries making sours are operating on the same philosophy as e-juice companies making a new vape juice. Trying to figure out, just throwing a bunch of random crap in there, a bunch of random different flavors.
And see what sticks?
See what sticks. 9 times out of 10 it ends up being palatable.
And then I was given what someone didn't want. It's Potter's Watermelon Sour Splash. It's a sweet and sour schnapps, 15%. I'm going to go hard on my shots. They're going to be more than just a shot to make up for the low percentage. But yeah, I've tried it already. It was really good.
Oh yeah, it sounds intriguing. I don't think I'd like it, but it sounds intriguing.
Well, it's got a busted cap, so that's another reason why it was given to me.
I think the whole thing is busted. I'm not going to lie to you, man.
Boo!
Boo!
So, Derek, what are our rules tonight?
Oh, yes. Here in our illustrious society, we abide by an ever-changing set of rules. Rule number 1, every time our main character does some traveling, we take a sip.
Rule number 2, every time communists do something bad to other communists, 3 sips.
And rule number 3, every time a Western power loses spectacularly, what are we going to do, Tim?
We're going to take a goddamn shot.
We're going to take a goddamn shot. Prost.
Cheers. So, Derek, who are we talking about tonight?
All right, so today is going to be an interesting topic because, yeah, I've mentioned on here before, I'm a little bit of a leftist, and I do spend a fair amount of time around other leftists. And something that you'll notice once you're around people like me is leftists don't agree with each other on pretty much anything, and will find any excuse to be mad at each other. I'm going to be talking about a topic today. To a lot of leftists, he's a very beloved figure, and to a lot of people around the world, he's a very beloved figure. He's definitely not going to be the worst person we've ever talked about. Far from it. I think he definitely had some redeeming qualities, but I'm also not going to. I'm not going to meat ride for this guy either, just because I somewhat sympathize with his cause, because he was kind of a bastard sometimes. And so, just be prepared. This is going to be one of those topics that can kind of get dicey in certain parts of Twitter. So, today we're going to be talking about the founding father of modern Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh. And this is also going to be a bit of a, I'm not going to say controversial. I don't think it'll be very controversial, but what I'm going to be talking about is not going to paint the United States or the United States military in a very positive light, or any Western nation for that matter. Nobody in the West comes out looking very good in this situation.
I feel like anytime communism is brought up at all and a Western power is involved, it kind of makes us look like shit.
Yeah.
Because we're always trying to sabotage it, even whether it's good or bad, or whether we should really be putting our fingers in that pie or not.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing about this guy is he was undoubtedly an outspoken and right up in your face Marxist-Leninist. But his movement and the fight that he fought, the struggle that he fought for, was not necessarily strictly a communist project.
Okay. It
was first and foremost a fight for independence for a colonial subject, which with that as its foundation, you have to do a lot of stuff to go from that to the bad guy.
Yeah.
And trust me, there have been plenty who have been able to make that leap. I'm going to posit just, not as like to kind of putting aside like the neutrality I should have as a student and a reader of an understander of history, that sort of neutrality that's necessary for understanding. To bring morality into it just a little bit, I don't think that Ho Chi Minh and his project in Vietnam necessarily gets to that point. I don't think they make that leap, though at some points he really does try. So let's go ahead and talk about this guy. But first, we need to set the stage a little bit, as we always do. That's step one for these things.
Yep, we always got to set the stage.
Let's talk about Indochina. Indochina it's a geographical region that's south of China and east of India. It's that little bit that kind of juts out between India and China. It juts out into the sea as like a big giant peninsula. That area is referred to as Indochina because it's between India and China. You're already a little bit smarter.
Okay.
So today, that region includes the nations of Cambodia, Laos, like the eastern bit of like traditionally what was called Siam, and specifically for our story, it included on the eastern coast of Indochina is the nation of Vietnam. Starting in the 1600s, the church in France was sending a lot of Catholic missionaries to Indochina. They really wanted to bring Catholicism to the Vietnamese and the Cambodians and the Laotians for some reason, completely inexplicable. Most of these missionaries were Jesuits. I think I've explained Jesuits to you before. Are you familiar with the term?
Want to give me a brief reminder because I'm coming up empty, but that doesn't mean you haven't explained it before.
Yeah, it's not super relevant, but I always find it very useful because Jesuits are interesting. They are members of the Catholic clergy that are adherents to this part of the church called the Society of Jesus, which are they're kind of like your chill Catholics. They're your more moderate ones. They're not super in your face with you know suppressing heretics and burning witches and stuff like that. They're more like you you do God's word not by punishing the unbeliever, but by showing the unbeliever the word of God. That's their kind of thing. So they've always been very focused on.
So pretty chill.
Yeah, they've been always been very opposed to a lot of state repression and the more conservative elements of the Catholic Church. Usually, it can be kind of iffy sometimes. And they've always been very supportive of education. A lot of Catholic priests who teach at Catholic schools are Jesuits. That's one of their callings. But they also have a very lurid history of colonialism. When the Catholic powers like France, Spain, and Portugal went out doing all of their objectively evil colonizer shit, Jesuits were very often the vanguard of that. And it always, the way that it always worked is a bunch of priests would go out evangelizing the word to the new world, or a new area of the world that Europeans have just come across. So they'll go there, they're spreading the word of God. And then now that there's a bunch of priests and also newly converted Christians there, it gives colonial powers inroads into the financial and political systems of these new areas, which it makes it easier to colonize later on. Sometimes Jesuits are passively involved, sometimes they're actively involved, like they were in the Spanish Empire and the Americas. It's a whole thing. In this case, they were very much actively involved.
Okay.
In the 1700s, the royal dynasty that ruled southern Vietnam, the southernmost part of Vietnam, who were called the Nguyen. You've seen that Vietnamese name, Nguyen. Half of all Vietnamese people are the name Nguyen.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the Nguyen dynasty ruled parts of southern Vietnam. They began trading with France, and they used this trade and all of these incoming missionaries to kind of help push their way into the political system of the Nguyen dynasty. And eventually they were able to use their wealth and their military technology to kind of support the Nguyen to start going out and conquering the rest of Indochina. And so eventually the Nguyen would go on to unite all of what would become Vietnam. And then later on, they would also go and conquer Laos and Cambodia. And so that was a whole slow process. It took almost a century. But eventually they would be the overall rulers of Eastern Indochina by 1802, the year 1802. Following that unification, the Nguyen imperial rulers tried to distance themselves from France, and they became really strongly isolationist. And during this period of Vietnamese history, it was a bit of a mixed bag because on the one hand, the Nguyen were genuinely pretty competent rulers. They had a good run of some really good national leaders that were really good at their jobs. They had a strong military thanks to all of the training and technology that were given to them by the French. And they also had a really effective imperial bureaucracy that followed this sort of Chinese model of Confucian thought. And then on the other hand, because they were so strongly isolationist, they had a really heavy hand dealing with anyone they deemed to be outsiders. So that included Catholics and Catholic missionaries, which they cracked down on a lot, but it also included other religious minorities like Muslims and the Baha'i, and also a lot of ethnic minorities, especially in Cambodia. So they didn't treat people very well.
That seems to be the running history from a lot of governments. Didn't treat people very well.
Yeah, that kind of that's part and parcel for the history of empire. They don't treat people very well, I've seemed to notice. I wonder if there's a connection there. The stronger the authority of the state, the more they seem to screw people over. I don't know. It remains a mystery. So all of these all these crackdowns of these ethnic minorities eventually results in a bunch of uprisings. Like in a 40-year span, they have something like 200 separate rebellions that they have to put down, which severely weakens their ability to rule. And then the final nail in the coffin came in the 1840s and 50s. A cholera epidemic spread through Indochina, and like 8% of the population of their kingdom was killed, which had a devastating effect on the economy, which had a domino effect on the bureaucratic administration and also on the military. And all of these factors combined gave Western European powers the sort of inroads they needed to assert more dominance over the region. And so France in 1858, who at this time France was the Second French Empire, which was ruled by Napoleon III, who was Napoleon's really dumb, incompetent nephew.
Damn.
Yeah, I'm definitely doing an episode on him eventually. He is such a funny story.
We have so many topics we could cover. I wish we had the time and money to just do this weekly and have someone else do our editing for us, but we don't.
So the Second French Empire invades Indochina, and within a year they have captured the capital city of Saigon. They forced the Vietnamese Empire to sign an unequal treaty called the Treaty of Saigon in 1862, which gave France control over all of their ports, as well as complete control over their foreign policy. And then later on in 1874, after a few more the Win trying to assert their independence a little more, eventually in 1874 they would force the Win to sign the Second Treaty of Saigon, which completely handed power over to the French colonial government and formally founded the colony of French Indochina. And so that is how Indochina becomes a French colony. The Win would continue to rule as puppets, and they would keep ruling until 1945, when some stuff we'll talk about later happens. But it would be completely as puppets, and all practical power was in the hands of the French colonial administration and the French military. So during this time, there's a huge amount of investment coming in from French businesses into the colony, and that was transforming the cities into like these bustling centers of commerce. Now, they weren't making people rich. I mean, they were making people rich. They were making French people rich. But in general, the Vietnamese did not reap the spoils of this economic growth.
Well, they usually don't.
With some specific exceptions. With all of this growth came cultural westernization. So lots of rail lines were laid, European buildings were constructed, French became a primary language of politics and commerce. And with all of these changes came the rise of a native Vietnamese middle class. So in the cities, you had people who were raised around French culture and French religion. They were usually Catholics or Catholic converts. They would go to French-speaking schools, learn French styles of schooling and different Western topics. They would grow up to become staunch liberals in like the Western mold. They would become very supportive of French domination of Indochina because they saw the French as being like bringers of civilization and wealth and growth and expansion and modernity. Really, they were modernism, the modern world coming to uplift the Vietnamese people in their eyes, and almost universally, all of these people were Catholic. All of this Vietnamese middle class. They made up the bulk of like the lower rungs of the French colonial bureaucracy. So all of the stuff that the colonial state was doing, they needed their like guys on the ground doing all the pencil pushing and paperwork. Usually that was done by like these new Vietnamese urban middle class Catholics. And they became very outspoken and influential within Vietnamese society, despite the fact that they were a very small minority of the country. And then out in the boonies, out in the country, it was a very different story. The vast majority of Vietnam, about 95% of the population, were farmers. Almost all of them were rice farmers. They were overwhelmingly Buddhist, and they hated all of the Catholics that were ruling Vietnam. They hated that Catholics were in charge. And they hated all of the French and all of the foreign influence that was ruling their country. They felt emasculated, I guess is a good word. They didn't like feeling like they didn't have control of their own country. You start to see the sprouts of like early Vietnamese nationalism come out of this period, specifically in the countryside. This was especially true in northern Vietnam, the region of Vietnam that the French colonial authorities referred to as the Protectorate of Annam. The general opinion in northern Vietnam was that they were strongly against the French, and they were strongly against the Nguyen dynasty kowtowing to the French. They did not like that. And all of their discontent eventually culminated in the Can Vong uprising in 1885, when this is a crazy story. A French admiral attempted to arrest the emperor.
Holy shit. He tried to arrest a fucking baby?
He tried to arrest a baby, and he tried to arrest the two regents that were ruling for the baby, because, a baby can't write laws. And he tried to arrest these guys because he believed that they didn't show him the proper deference during a diplomatic meeting. He believed that the emperor should bow to him, an admiral of the French Navy. And so, to keep from getting arrested, they all ran into the countryside. They fled from their palace, and they hid somewhere. And while they were gone, the French just got another member of the family and installed that other guy, as like their puppet ruler, to try and stamp out the last little bit of like independence in this kingdom. In response to that, northern Vietnam exploded into violence and revolt. So yeah, the revolt lasted about a year. It was eventually crushed because this is a Western colonial power at the height of colonialism. There's no beating them. But even though the revolt was crushed, it set the tone for France's relationship with the Vietnamese people. All of the pretense was gone, and France was going to hold Indochina with an iron fist. And it wasn't going to be pretty. It wasn't going to be tranquil. It wasn't a benevolent ruler shepherding his subjects. It was a brutal authoritarian stamping his foot on the collective neck of Vietnam.
That's how it goes a lot of the time, unfortunately.
So soon after the rebellion, the French would begin a crackdown on Buddhist practices, and they implemented a system that they called the corvée. I think we've talked about the corvée before when we talked about the French Revolution. Do you remember that at all?
Again, you'll have to remind me. I've slept since then, brother.
Okay. Yeah, so before they chopped the king's head off, the nobility in France had this practice called the corvée, which is where they would press gang random peasants into essentially slavery to force them to work on public works projects. And then once the project was done, if they survived, then they would be allowed to go back home. And that's what the French did with the Vietnamese people. They would go into random villages, round up a bunch of people, force them into slavery, have them work to like lay down a rail line or telegraph wires or build a building or something. And then if they survived the horrid working conditions and usually being beaten if they weren't good at their job, if they survived, then they'd be allowed to go home.
Jesus Christ.
Yep. This was despite the fact that the corvée system was illegal in France, and it had been illegal since they chopped the king's head off for about 100 years. Like, imagine if in the 1960s they still had slavery 100 years after the 13th Amendment was passed, and then I remembered they had prisons in the 1960s.
We still have fucking slavery.
Yeah, we still have prisons today. There's still slavery in the U.S., but...
Although people will fight you till you're blue in their face, saying that prison labor is not slavery.
It's not slavery because the people that are being enslaved deserve it. Got the big thing going. So, the corvée system had two different purposes. One was to put the peasants in their place. Two, they made an exemption from the corvée for Catholics. And so it was a way of motivating people to convert to Catholicism. So if you're a Catholic Vietnamese, you didn't get enslaved. So you can kind of see how this all would piss people off, right?
Well, of course.
So these are the divisions that we have in Vietnamese society, and it's along two axes. One is the division between the Buddhist peasantry and the urban Catholic middle class, and then the other one is the division between pro-French sentiment in the south and anti-French sentiment in the north. This would after a lot of twists and turns and political evolution, this would eventually become the conflict between North and South Vietnam. And it was during the birth of this political climate that our guy was born. In a small village in North Vietnam called Long Sen, a mid-level magistrate by the name of Win Sin Sac had his wife her name was Wang Ti Lon, and she had a child on May 19th, 1890, and he was a son who they named Win Sin Kung. He would grow up to be called Ho Chi Minh. I couldn't find a crazy amount about his family. There's pretty much nothing that's known about his mom besides that she was his mom and was probably just a homemaker.
Damn.
We do know he had 3 siblings. He had one brother who died as a baby. He had another brother he went out into the woods and became a hermit and kind of worked as a traditional herbalist. And then he had a sister who worked as a clerk for the French army. And that's all we know about them.
Wow.
Yeah. We know a little bit more about his father because he had some interesting story of his own. This guy, he was a magistrate, which is kind of a broad term that refers to somebody who's kind of a teacher and an academic, but he also kind of was sometimes like a judge and also like a tax collector. He just worked for the government. He did anything that the government kind of needed. And usually that would be a pretty cushy job. But the problem was he was blacklisted from promotion within the regional sort of the regional sort of magistrates for kind of mysterious reasons. But the big story that always comes up that I found is that at some point he was a judge presiding over a court case against a landlord who had broken some law in regards to the way he was extracting rent from his tenants, and he found the landlord guilty and ordered this landlord, who was in his 70s, ordered him to be sentenced to 102 lashes with a cane.
Might as well just kill the poor fuck.
He did. The guy died.
No, I mean, just be more direct about it. You know he's trying to fucking kill him. Just have some balls and say, okay, let's hang him. Don't be cruel about it, for fuck's sake.
Yeah. And so he ended up he was demoted from his position as a magistrate for quote-unquote abuse of power.
No shit.
He was kind of blacklisted from his regional magistrate, but he was offered opportunities to take positions within the imperial government itself, so the imperial administration, but he refused to take any of those jobs because he would have to be working for the French, and he hated the French, and he passed that hatred down to his son.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, it was principled, but it also meant that he and his family lived in poverty. So the young Ho was tutored with a traditional Confucian education like his father was. And from an early age, he was exposed to a lot of those rebellious ideas that his dad had. His dad was, even though he worked as like a cop, basically, or like a cop who was a man of letters, basically, is the best way I can describe him. But he was still kind of a rebel in his own way.
I'm sorry, you said man of letters. I can only think of fucking Supernatural's men of letters.
You disgust me.
Bitch, we just talked like a episode or two ago about doing a Supernatural watch as like side content for the podcast. Don't give me that fucking shit.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That would be so much fun, though. So not only was he exposed to like these ideas from his father, but the province that he grew up in was also a hotbed for rebellious activity against the French.
Vive la Revolution.
So he was exposed to these ideas very early and carried them for the rest of his life. As a young boy, his favorite hobbies were exploring the woods, or I say woods, well, exploring the jungle. It was jungle, but kind of going out and exploring. He loved fishing, and he loved flying kites. Those were his great pastimes. In 1908, at the age of 18, he was admitted to a college in the city of Hue that was run by the French because it was just the most prestigious college he could get into. So he took the opportunity. And while he was there, he received a Western education in social sciences and politics. And it's possible this is where he first got involved in anti-French organizing.
I mean, to be fair, fuck the French.
Fuck the French, yeah, absolutely. They don't even have to be doing anything. I still don't like the French. So, in 1911, at the age of 21, he decided that he wanted to see the world. So he got a...
Traveling.
Yeah, traveling.
That is ASIP.
So he got a job as a cook on board a French merchant steamer. He ended up going to France. So he spent some time in France and didn't really do much his first trip to France. It won't be his last, I can guarantee you that. Oh boy, he goes to France a lot. He never stays in France, but he goes there a lot.
He hates it, but he loves it at the same time.
Yeah, he's got a lot of friends in France, and he likes the culture. He just hates what they do to his homeland.
Fair enough.
So after France, he goes and he actually goes to the United States. He spent some time in the U.S. And his time in the U.S. is when we know for sure that he is involved in like political stuff, like politics, political organizing. That's the first time we see it.
Gotcha.
So he spent some time living in Boston, a little bit of time living in Harlem, in New York City, and while he's here, he meets a few different groups of people. He meets some Korean nationalists who are exiles from Korea because they were kind of forced to flee from the Japanese colonial authority in Korea, and he connects with them a lot. They've got a lot of common ground there. He also gets to reading the works of this guy named Marcus Garvey, who is... We talked about Marcus Garvey in our episode about Malcolm X. He was the first prominent Pan-Africanist and Black nationalist. And he founded an organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And so
Is it bad I still cringe every time I hear that word, even though I know it's a historical word?
I get it. I'm used to it at this point, just because these are kind of the areas in history where it was used.
Oh, fuck! Did I tell you that story about Miss Weaver? She was reading a book to us. This was at NEO. She was one of the comp teachers, and she read out. I can't remember what book it was, but it had the N-word in it, and she's like, "I'm not gonna censor myself." And I know there's African American people in here. I'm just reading the book. If you don't want to show up that day, that's fine. Just dropped it full pace, didn't hesitate, just kept going.
See, now I'm not black, so my opinion doesn't mean anything. But from my perspective, I would think that I should be giving black folk enough credit to...
I think she was trying to come from the angle, hey, I'm reading this book to the class. I'm not going to censor the book. This is exactly how it's saying. I understand if you don't want to hear a white person say that word. That's the most credit I'll give her. Could be wrong on that, but...
When people say that, I just can't help but thinking, like, that's just a way of rewording, like, Yeah, I'm gonna say it. I'm gonna be politically incorrect. Like it feels like it's the same vibe, even though it's coming from a different place. You know what I'm saying?
I can I can get what you're getting at. Do I think Miss Weaver needed to say it? Fuck no, she did not.
So yeah, while he's in the U.S., he attends meetings of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and he's kind of just like getting like the vibe of like kind of making connections with other people who are kind of experiencing the same types of stuff that his own people are experiencing back in Vietnam, and he's kind of finding common ground and kind of like learning how it is that they're approaching it and how they understand it and how they're resisting it. And that's what really starts to form the initial sorts of like nebulous ideas in his mind that later on, when he discovers socialism and Marxism, kind of gives him like a framework in which to frame those sorts of thoughts that he's starting to bounce around at this moment.
Gotcha.
But what's interesting about his time in the United States is that he was kind of like an America-boo. Like,
that's hilarious.
he kind of glorified the United States in a way. He had very positive opinions of the United States. He obviously, I mean, you don't go to a black nationalist meeting without kind of getting an understanding of how the United States is kind of fucking bad for a lot of people. Specifically, he read like a lot of the works of like Jefferson and Thomas Paine, and he read the Bill of Rights, he read the Declaration of Independence, and he thought all of that shit ruled. He thought it was great. It was awesome. And it was, that really helped, that formed a lot of his beliefs as well. In fact, he took a lot of his, later on, when he would declare the Democratic Republic of Vietnam as its first president and declare independence, the copy of his Declaration of Independence would make it onto the desk of President Harry Truman, and I think it was Truman that once he read it, he said, "Where did this man read the American Declaration of Independence? Where did he read? Because it was almost word for word the same.
That
it was almost like Control F'd replace America with Vietnam. Like, it was very close. It very obviously took inspiration from the U.S. And he, until very late in his life, would believe that America had America would eventually see common cause with the Vietnamese people that the American people once had against the British, and that common cause would bring America to their support. And it was at the very end of his life when he was proven wrong.
Fuck.
So after that, he moved over to England, and he was in England during World War I, when World War I was going on, which is a crazy time to be in England.
Damn.
Yeah, England got real fucked up during World War I. They were crazy.
No shit.
And then eventually the war ended, and he went back to France in 1919. While he was in France, he became friends with a man by the name of Marcel Cachin, or Cachin. It's French. Marcel Cachin. Cachin was a politician. He was a writer, and he was a member of the French section of the Workers' International, which was...
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, the International was basically like a congress that represented all of the different socialist organizations from around the world. He was a delegate to the Workers' International from France, and he was a very staunch, outspoken Marxist. And it's generally believed that this is where Ho Chi Minh was introduced to Marxism. At the same time, while he was in Paris, he spent time with other Vietnamese immigrants who were members of this anti-colonial protest group called the Group of Vietnamese Patriots. While he was with this group, he began writing articles for their newspaper under the pseudonym Win I Quoc, which translates roughly as Win the Patriot.
Okay. And
that was another common name he was referred to as. A lot of his comrades, when he would return to Vietnam during the guerrilla war, would refer to him as Win I Quoc. And in his articles, he advocated for the French government to recognize the civil rights of the Vietnamese people, and also for greater Indo-Chinese autonomy. During that time, 1919, 1920, that's when the Versailles Convention was being held. That's when they were debating and writing out the points of the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War One. This was after the ceasefire, so the war was over, but this was when they were actually doing the treaty. And this was when you get a lot of stuff like basically like modern international laws and rules for like how you conduct war. Basically cementing like the rights of a nation into ink and paper.
Okay.
That's when these ideas like first come about, or not first come about, but first become like something resembling international law. It's when people start to care about like the self, like the rights of nations to be independent and to forge their own destinies, basically. And a lot of Vietnamese people were looking at the French, who are big advocates for this concept, and they were looking at France and then looking back at their own home country of Vietnam, where their people lived under the boot of a foreign oppressor that was now talking about autonomy and the rights of nations. And we're like, what the fuck? What the fuck? What is wrong with you people? And Ho was a really important figure during this time because he was the best at kind of putting those feelings and those thoughts into words. Like the frustration and the disappointment of like all of these French people talking a big game, and then not when they have the opportunity to do exactly that for the Vietnamese people, don't. And that's when he first starts to get a name for himself amongst other Vietnamese people. He especially became kind of a big deal when he spearheaded a petition campaign to all of the major leaders of all of the Entente powers during the war. So like the French Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. He was writing all of them like constantly, petitioning to have the Vietnamese people, the people of Indochina, included in the discussions at Versailles. And he was ignored, obviously. They don't care about Vietnamese people. But it's still like it put him on the radar for like the Vietnamese nationalist protest circles. The main reason they ignored him was because by this point he was a very outspoken socialist, and he was publicly supporting the Bolsheviks and the Russian Revolution, which was still going on at that time. In 1920, he attended this meeting called the Congress of Tours in the city of Tours in France. And that was the meeting where they formally founded the Communist Party of France. And he became one of the founding members of the French Communist Party. And that is still today, that party is still like a very prominent, or not very prominent, but like they still get voted for a lot. Like a lot of people still vote in France today. They always get seats in every election. He helped found the party, and then he became disillusioned with the party because every time he tried to direct them to put out public support for Vietnamese independence, they always ignored him. Of
course.
So after only a few months, he just left.
Fuck that. I mean, I don't blame him. Fuck that shit.
Yeah, fuck those people. Fuck the French. In 1923, right after the Russian Civil War ended and the Soviet Union was founded, he was invited to Russia by some fellow communists to study at a university in Russia, which had just been founded as like it was kind of a mix between like an actual university and kind of like a political training academy for people from basically so that the Bolsheviks could make their own agents that they could then send out to East Asia to kind of spread Bolsheviks ideas and organize communist movements that would be under the direction of the Communist Party in Moscow.
Okay.
And he kind of did some stuff there. By the way, that never worked out. They were very successful at training people to be good organizers and guerrillas. And then once they actually got out, they just ignored Moscow. Which is exactly what happened. Exactly what happened with Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh always had a very contentious relationship with other communists. So he went to Russia in 1923. Then in 1924 he went to China, which this was an insane time to be in China.
Oh, really now?
This was right smack in the middle of the Chinese Civil War.
Oh, fuck.
When the entire country was just broken apart by a bunch of warlords. But he went to China. He went to the province, or I can't remember if it's a city or province of Canton, and also spent time teaching at the the Guangdong Military Academy, which was like the main officer training school for the nationalist forces in the Chinese Civil War, which at the time still had a large communist part, and so the Guangdong Military Academy was a really popular training ground for Asian communists to go and like learn how to do war. And that's where he met all of the most radical anti-colonial Vietnamese nationalists. And that's where he first kind of established himself in like the most radical militant parts. Also, while he was in China, he met a Chinese woman named Zheng Zhuaming.
Okay.
And they got married.
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah, they stayed married for the rest of their lives. They had a couple kids. He'd end up having some grandkids, and they seemed to really love each other. It's really sweet. A lot of his Vietnamese comrades were kind of racist towards Chinese people, and they didn't approve of his marriage. And he always just told them to fuck off.
That's the exact way you need to react. Fuck off.
Even like his closest friends, he was like, "Fuck off. You shut up. Don't mind your own business." Even then, he was always kind of problematic about it.
Of course.
Because he was always like, what does it matter to you if I have a wife? I have a woman who loves me, who will make me dinner, who will keep my home, who will raise my kids. What do I have to complain about if she's Chinese? that was kind of his approach to it, which...
I mean, it shouldn't fucking matter. Like, I've never really gotten the, oh, I have a type kind of thing. People like, oh, I'll never date this race or blah, 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 or this, that, and the other. I'm like, if I find you attractive, I find you attractive. I can't really put down a list of what makes people attractive. It's just I do or don't. It's not based on like racial or anything like that. So
yeah. Do you breathe and do you laugh at my jokes? Anything else is just a bonus. So yeah, while he was in Guangdong, he was teaching. He was teaching like political science and political theory at this school as part of like the military curriculum, but he was also learning like military tactics himself. He was doing a lot of the training as well. This is where he learns how to fight, and specifically how to fight an insurgency. And he gets really good at it too.
I had assumed fucking so from what I've heard about him.
Yeah, unarguably, it cannot be argued. Ho Chi Minh is one of the greatest guerrilla commanders in all of human history. And it not just from like a military standpoint, but in all facets, military, social, political. He knew how to lead a military force in an insurgency, and he knew how to leverage public support and popular support to aid and direct that military power. He was incredible. There's a reason Vietnam is communist today, and a lot of it has to do with just how fucking good this guy was at fighting guerrilla wars.
Fuck yeah.
So he does that for a few years in Guangdong. And in 1927, the Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, often you'll see it in English as the Kuomintang. I don't like to pronounce it like that. That's not how you pronounce it in Chinese. The closest we can really get with American accents is Kuomintang. So I would pronounce it. But you'll usually see it abbreviated as KMT, so whenever you see that, that's the Chinese nationalists. Anyways, at this point, the Chinese nationalists had a very large section of it. Like the left Kuomintang were like outspoken socialists and communists and trade unionists and people like that. And then in 1927, one of their generals, this guy named Chiang Kai-shek, he launches a coup and overthrows the leadership of the party and takes control for himself, and immediately purges all of the socialist elements from the Kuomintang.
Well, damn.
Yeah, he kills a whole lot of people. Boy, Chiang Kai-shek was a real bad guy. Yeah, you know, something that's really funny that I always like to bring up whenever I hear people talking about Chiang Kai-shek, especially like if I'm on Twitter and I see people talking about like how bad Mao was or whatever. Like, he was bad. Like, they try to like hold up Chiang Kai-shek as like this anti-communist crusader. And I like to post the headshot of Chiang's son in his SS uniform. Because his son was His son went to a school in Berlin when the Nazis came to power, and he joined the Waffen-SS.
Jesus Christ.
Because they had very similar politics.
I'll bet.
Because if you ever meet somebody who's like a really ardent, don't get me wrong, despite the fact that I am a leftist, I consider myself a socialist. There have been a lot of really bad socialists, a lot of really bad people who have done their bad stuff in the cause of socialism. If somebody is like a really dedicated, ardent, like it's the center of their politics is anti-communism, they are either a fascist, like an explicit fascist, or B, somebody who would be more than willing to work with fascists if given the opportunity. And that's 100%. There's no exceptions. Anyways, off my soapbox. So yeah, there was this coup in 1927. Chiang Kai-shek comes to power. He leads the Kuomintang to finally win this giant civil war. It's the first. He doesn't know this yet. It's the first part of the Civil War. The second one comes later. That's when the Reds get their revenge. But for the time being, Ho Chi Minh has to run away. He has to flee from China. He spent a little bit more time bouncing all around the world. And it's during this time he's taken all of his lessons from France, from the United States, from the Soviet Union, and from China. He's taken all of these lessons that he's learned and he's congealed them all together into his sort of Vietnamese nationalist communist ideology. And from this point forward, everywhere he goes, everywhere he travels, he is meeting with other Vietnamese nationalists who are exiled or just emigres, and he's organizing them. He's organizing all of these disparate groups into like a single cohesive force with him as the linchpin.
Okay.
So not only is he creating this giant, and he's not just meeting with communists, he's meeting with nationalists of all stripes. His first goal, first and foremost, is Vietnamese independence.
Okay.
After that's achieved, then he can focus on the communism stuff. But for now, his main goal is uniting anybody who hates the French and wants a free Vietnam into a single banner with him as the linchpin, so he can leverage that for his and leverage that as like the leader of this movement that he's building. And he does it expertly. Everywhere he goes, everybody loves him. Everybody loves his ideas. Everybody loves his rhetoric. He is inspiring this international Vietnamese independence. And he's just so good at this stuff. And so eventually he'd unite all of like the most left radical parts of this movement and get them all together in a meeting in Hong Kong in 1930. And there he would found the Indo-Chinese Communist Party with himself as the chairman. He is the leader of this. And in one fell swoop, he becomes the chairman of the most well-disciplined and organized Vietnamese independence group on the planet. And it is very much like a sort of turning point for Vietnamese independence.
Hell yes.
Yeah. Also, the whole time that he's doing all of this traveling and stuff, he is being watched like a hawk.
No shit.
By both the French and British governments. They have their spies following him everywhere. And he is fully aware of it. He knows 100% he's being watched. And he does not care.
I mean, if I was doing what he was doing, I would just kind of at that point assume I'm under watch.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. These governments will watch people for a whole lot. I mean,
it takes a whole lot less than that to get, watched by a lot of governments. So fuck it.
Yeah, I mean, fuck. George Orwell spent 6 months fighting fascists in Spain. And then for the rest of his life, all he does is write, and he's being watched like a hawk by the British government, like he's going to be planning some like giant revolution. Like he did after he got out of Spain, all he did was write. He never organized. He wasn't politically active. All he did was write, and he was still being spied on constantly. Western intelligence I shouldn't say that. That's not fair. All intelligence organizations, by their very nature, are neurotic freaks. Anyways, while he was in Hong Kong in 1931. Which Hong Kong at this time was still a British territory. It was a British colony. Which, fun fact, they would remain a British colony until I think the 1990s.
Damn.
Which is crazy. In 1931, he was arrested by British police in Hong Kong. because at the behest of the French, because Britain had extradition with France, and basically the French came and asked, like, "Hey, can you arrest this guy? He's getting a little too uppity, trying to free our colony. Can you go ahead and just hand him over to us?" And they were like, "Yeah, sure, why not?" They didn't really want to do it, but like, they're allies. But he was successfully able to petition the British government to let him go, and I'm not sure how or why. I'm not sure what he said, but he sent letters directly to the Privy Council, which is like the king of England's like private advisory council, and sent a letter directly to them and got the British government to let him go without handing him over to the French.
The fuck?
I have no idea how he pulled that off, but whatever. So, but he was still exiled. They just didn't give him to the French. He still had to leave Hong Kong. And so he ended up moving back to Moscow. He went back to Russia. So he flees from Hong Kong, and he ends up going back to chill with some of his communist friends in Moscow. The only problem is he ends up in Moscow in 1932.
Yikes.
You know what happened in Moscow in 1932?
Nope, but you're going to tell me.
That's when Stalin began his purges.
Fuck!
This guy, Ho Chi Minh, was the Forrest Gump of communism.
It fucking sounds like it. Christ's sake.
Right as Stalin's purges were starting. So yeah, he managed to ride out of the waves of like the earliest arrests and executions and stuff, and he was able to hang out in Moscow for a few years because he was really good friends with a lot of like high members of the Comintern, which is the Communist International. It's the new version of the workers, the international that existed before, but it's kind of a puppet organization under the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. That's kind of how the Soviets direct and organize all these other communist movements throughout the world. And he had a lot of friends in the Comintern who kind of gave him cover, but eventually Stalin came for them too. And so since he wasn't technically a Soviet, Stalin didn't really care about like killing him like he was a lot of the other guys. But he did want him out because he did have a lot of connections to people that Stalin didn't trust.
That makes sense.
And so when Ho Chi Minh finally fell out of favor with Stalin, he was stripped of his position as the chairman of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, the party that he founded.
That's fucked.
Which, it's crazy that they had the authority to do that, but they did, and then they forced him into exile out of the Soviet Union, and so he was forced to leave another place again. Luckily, by that time, there was another big communist movement that was starting to be a pretty big deal. He went back to China, because by this point, Mao Zedong had led his Chinese Communist Party in revolt against So eventually, Chiang Kai-shek had, after he took control of the Kuomintang, he had swept through this. It was this campaign called the Northern Expedition, and he swept through and conquered northern China and completely reunified China. And he became the last warlord standing. And he founded...
Damn.
Yeah, he founded the Republic of China. And then immediately after that was when Mao Zedong and his Communist Party rose up out of nowhere and started this giant guerrilla campaign that pushed the Kuomintang back out of northern China. And they were in the middle... And here's the problem. They were in the middle of their civil war when the Japanese invaded China in 1936. In 1934, the Japanese invaded China. And so that was a really bad time because they had dedicated all of their military power to fighting each other.
Damn.
And so they didn't have a lot of defenses prepared when the Chinese suddenly launched their surprise invasion. So a lot of people died really fast. Have you ever heard of Nanking? The Rape of Nanking or Nanjing?
That's what I was going to say, the Rape of Nanking, yeah. That's what I knew. I was like, I thought that was a Japanese thing.
Yeah, it was a Japanese. It's when the Japanese invaded China. That's what's going on at this point. So Ho Chi Minh goes to China, and he becomes like a political advisor to the Chinese like communist army who were fighting the Japanese at the time. And he would stay in that position for a little while. And it was while he was doing this that news reached China that it was while he was in China with the Chinese Communist Party that word reached China that this little man with a goofy mustache in Germany had decided to invade Poland in 1939.
The funny man with the funny mustache.
Fuck the funny man with the funny mustache. And when this
Not literally. He can just go burn in hell like he already is.
when this very very goofy man invaded Poland, Britain and France decided that they'd had enough, and so they declared war on him too. And then after he got done conquering Poland, then the Nazis turned their armies around and sent them to Blitzkrieg France, and France fell within a month. It only took about a month for the Nazis to conquer France. It happened very quickly.
Yeah, that's why they've got the give her up thing.
Yeah, they had the undisputed strongest military in Europe for like 1,000 years, but now they're remembered as surrender monkeys because of that one time.
All it takes is one time.
That's crazy to me. That's wild.
I mean, I don't need an excuse to hate the French.
But yeah, so France was conquered by the Nazis. The Nazis occupied northern France, and then southern France was kind of broken off into a puppet government called Vichy France, and they were the Nazi collaborationist government. And the colonial administration of Indochina was placed under Vichy France. But the problem was Vichy France was very weak and very disorganized and only had half the resources they had before because the other half was occupied by the Germans. And so they didn't really have the time or the ability to really care about Indochina. And so all of a sudden, the Indo-Chinese colonial government really wasn't in a good spot. They were very disorganized.
I can only imagine.
And so Ho Chi Minh and some of his other Vietnamese buddies they're in China, like watching all the stuff going on with the Japanese and the Chinese and they look back home. Well, that looks good. I think it's time to go back home. Hey, you see those guys over there? They're running out of ammunition and food. You know what I think we should do? Let's go kill them.
Of course. Because of course.
And so Ho Chi Minh gets him and all of his dudes together, and they go back to Vietnam in 1940. This is the first time that Ho Chi Minh's been in Vietnam in 21 years. It's been 21 years since he's been back home.
Oh, fuck. Also, sip, travel.
Yep.
Wait, did we take one for the France part?
Oh, we've missed a whole bunch, dude.
Let's just take like 4 to make up for that. I wasn't even thinking. When you're going from travel to travel to travel, I don't think of it like that, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, he's kind of always traveling during this time. That's why I made it the one sip rule. I thought, hey, I know he travels a lot. Let's just make that. And I remembered, like, that's all he ever does. We'd just be constantly sipping. In 1941, Ho Chi Minh and all of his boys returned to Vietnam for the first time in 2 decades.
It's your boy, Ho Chi Minh.
It's your boy. Guess what we're doing? We're founded the Viet Minh. Gang, gang. So yeah, they get back, and once they get back, they found a new organization called the Vietnam Doc Yap Dong Minh, which translates into English as the League for the Independence of Vietnam. But they're usually referred to by their Vietnamese abbreviation, the Viet Minh.
Okay.
So once they come and they announce this organization has been founded, immediately, like within a month, they have tens of thousands of supporters coming to join their ranks. And that recruitment just stays up. They are constantly recruiting. People are flocking to their banner all the time. They immediately gain, because at this point, they've suffered from several generations of French colonial rule, which suck. And it's always been kind of hopeless. And for the very first time, they have hope. And then they finally get this guy. Fuck, where were we? Holy shit. The Viet Minh had just been founded. They were getting a shit ton of recruits. People just fucking, they flocked. People in Vietnam just flocked from all across the country to go join the Viet Minh. So initially when they first got there, the Viet Minh were formed to fight against French colonial authority. And then, like, right after they got there and formed their guerrilla, like, insurgent army, the Japanese invaded.
Fuck.
And Oh boy, it got you. You know what the Japanese do when they invade somewhere, right?
I mean, it's like most places, rape and pillage, right?
Oh, it's so far beyond that. It's like sport.
Oh, is this like the borderline the next rape of Nanking?
What they did to Nanking is just repeated, like everywhere that the Japanese Imperial Army went throughout the Pacific. It's like just 1,000 small Nanking. Nanking was the big one because they did it to one of like the major cities of China. Like Nanking used to be the capital of China, and they did all of that on like a giant scale across the entire city with a lot of cameras on them. But that same stuff they did everywhere they went. Oh, it's just on smaller scales. Like they were raping, they were looting, they were finding increasingly cruel ways to kill civilians. During their occupation of Nanking itself, there are pictures. Some of the most fucking haunting pictures I've ever seen are pictures that were not only taken but were run in newspapers in Japan, showing Japanese soldiers playing a game where they would throw babies back and forth and try to catch them on their bayonets. That's the kind of stuff they did. The Imperial Japanese Army were like the Nazis. They were bad, but they were bad in an orderly way. They were efficient. They got their bad shit done. The Imperial Japanese Army were all over the place. So tens of thousands of people are flocking to the Viet Minh's banner. Japan invades Indochina, and so there isn't like a whole lot to say about what the Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh were doing during World War II. It's kind of straightforward. The Japanese invade Indochina, and they wanted to use Indochina as like a stepping stone to invade other like European colonial holdings in Asia, specifically like India. They really want to get into India. India is kind of the big money maker for the British Empire, so that'd be like a big blow to the English. But the important things about the Viet Minh is, one, for the entire occupation of Indochina, they were a huge thorn in the side of the Japanese. They were really, really good guerrilla fighters because they were trained by Ho Chi Minh and all of his comrades, who were all trained in, like, politically trained in the Soviet Union and militarily trained in the Guangdong Military Academy. So they knew what the fuck they were doing, and they were really effective against the Japanese occupation. The second thing is, all of these years of, like, these 4 years of fighting against the Japanese occupation made them really... So yeah, so over these 4 years of fighting the Japanese, this guerrilla army gets really, really good. Like, they started out pretty good. They ended the war really good. Like, one of probably the most effective guerrilla army on the planet at the end of World War II. Just fantastic fighters, experts at ambushes, at jungle fighting, at demolition and sabotage, things like that. Just all around incredible fighters. The third big important thing is, by the end of the war, Ho Chi Minh is a national hero in Vietnam. He is their guy. He is the guy. He is the man who led them to victory. In fact, during the war, he becomes so beloved by the Vietnamese people that he starts getting called Ho Chi Minh. That's where he gets his name. Ho Chi Minh translates as bringer of light.
Fuck! That's hard.
That goes so hard. That is an incredible name.
That's metal as fuck.
So, as the war comes to a close, the Japanese are withdrawing, right? And as they're leaving, the French colonial forces, what's left of them, they aren't big enough and they aren't organized enough and they're not supplied enough to be able to reassert control over the entire region. And so that gives the Viet Minh the opportunity that once the Japanese leave, they can kind of rise up and fill the power vacuum. And so, oh, also, I forgot to mention, throughout the war, Ho Chi Minh's whole opinion on the United States is bolstered. Like his thoughts that like eventually the U.S. will come around and recognize his cause and the Vietnamese cause and give them support. Because during the war, during his guerrilla insurgency, a lot of their attacks were made possible by intelligence that were given to them by the OSS, which the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, was the intelligence branch of the United States during World War II, and would later be reorganized into the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. And during the war, the sections of the OSS in Indochina were actively providing intelligence on Japanese troop movements to the Viet Minh, and made a lot of their attacks possible. And so Ho Chi Minh thought, hey, these Americans, they're helping us out. They're giving us... Guys, I think these guys might be on our side. I think we might be able to bring them over to this whole independence thing. Maybe they could put pressure on the French. Help get the French off of our back. I think that'd be... I think they could do it. I think that's in the cards. That's in the cards. We just need to play our hand right. He was obviously wrong. That for one, the United States doesn't. Here's the thing about the United States. The United States has always strongly believed in the rights of man, and the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the rights to autonomy and independence for the little guy, the oppressed smaller nations of the world, unless they're not white.
But of course.
Nobody in Washington, D.C. has ever heard the term Vietnam before.
Wow.
When Ho Chi Minh starts writing, or whenever he's writing, because he's writing all the time, he's one of his favorite hobbies is just writing letters to world leaders just to see what happens. And he writes a whole lot of letters to a bunch of powerful people in the United States. And invariably, like, no joke, actually what happens whenever they receive these letters, they'll start reading it and they'll be like, what is Vietnam? Where is that? Just, they've never heard of it before. They might have heard of Indochina. They might even have heard of Annam, which is the French name for northern Vietnam. They've never heard the term Vietnam before. So, like, no, the United States was never, ever in a million years going to help the Viet Minh. That was never in the cards.
So he was kind of Delulu?
Yeah, he really liked the United States, and he just really wanted the United States to like him back. It just never worked out like that.
Uncle Sam won't recognize me. Ooh, ooh.
CIA Chan. Or no, CIA Senpai. And, oh god, what was that guy's name? Shit. God, there's one guy, there's these two brothers who were like two of the founders of the CIA. They always worked with, oh god, what were their names? Dulles, the Dulles brothers. Yeah, it's like two of like the earliest figures in the CIA, and absolute maniacs who reaped terror and destruction across the entire planet. And just imagining Ho Chi Minh like, Mr. Dulles, may I have guns, please? Can you come get the French, please? Anyways, so the Viet Minh rise to fill this power vacuum. Now the Japanese are gone and the French aren't able to really do anything. And so Ho Chi Minh had hoped that with the support of the OSS, he could get the United States to pressure France into coming to the negotiating table and eventually granting independence through diplomacy. He hoped that he could liberate Vietnam through like a treaty, because after getting, I don't blame him. After getting out of 4 years of fighting the Japanese, I'd be pretty sick of war too.
I probably would be sick of war from getting out of any war. I'd be just like, fuck this shit.
Yeah, I like there are people who are traumatized by a war that'll last. Like there are people with PTSD after like the Yom Kippur War that lasted like 11 days. Like, can you imagine 4 years of fighting the Japanese in the fucking jungles of Vietnam?
Fuck. An 11-day war. I didn't know that was a thing.
Oh yeah, Israel's had a few like really short wars, but like imagine 4 years of living in the jungle, just getting eaten alive by mosquitoes and bitten by venomous snakes, and whenever you're not being like eaten alive by the jungle, you're fighting like the biggest maniacs in human history. God, what a nightmare. So yeah, he was. So when they come in and fill this power vacuum in August of 1945, the Viet Minh formally they formed a provisional government and declared independence from everybody.
I mean, yeah.
Specifically, both the French and the Japanese, but they make a point of like, no outside power is ever going to rule Vietnam again.
Smart.
And so far they've been proven correct. No outside power has ever ruled Vietnam ever since.
Technically correct. The best kind of correct.
The best kind of correct, yes. And this event is now referred to as the August Revolution in Vietnam. It's considered the founding of modern Vietnam, Vietnamese Independence Day. It's called the August Revolution. Technically, it was September 2nd, but a lot of the important bits kind of happen in August, and then the independence was declared September 2nd.
It's like how we arbitrarily picked July 4th for Independence Day.
Yeah, when really most of the signatures went on that thing on July 2nd.
Yeah.
So yeah, the August Revolution happens. Ho Chi Minh declares independence. He is named by the Viet Minh as the chairman and premier of the newly founded Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And then he immediately gets to work trying to reach out and get official recognition from a bunch of different countries across the planet.
How does that go?
And nobody recognizes the new Vietnamese government.
Fucking hell.
Everybody, even the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's like, not the time, bro. Listen, we just lost like 40 million people in this war. We're busy right now. So Ho decided to go on an international tour. He left all of the governing of the new country to the party and to the Politburo, and went on an international tour in order to petition other nations to recognize Vietnamese independence. And while he's gone, Vietnam starts to get a little squirrely.
As tends to happen.
Yeah, post-colonial independence is always a really weird time for a nation's politics. Nothing is set in stone. They don't really have like political culture or traditions to kind of, ground everything. And so everything's kind of just up in the air. Anything is possible. Like nothing is taboo. Nothing is forbidden. It's all new. And so on the one hand, during the election of the first Congress of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, about 2/3 of all of the representatives in Congress that were elected were from parties and from groups that were unaffiliated with the Viet Minh, which suggests that there was like a high amount of like there wasn't like any election tampering. There was a high amount of like freedom and the ability for like other parties to challenge the Viet Minh. It seemed on the face of it to be a very democratic process. Shortly thereafter, a few anti-communist nationalist parties try to launch a coup to overthrow the Communist Party, and they fail. And a purge is initiated in the aftermath, and about 6,000 people are either murdered or deported. And then after that, opposition parties are banned, and it becomes a one-party state. So,
fuck.
So the wind blows. Meanwhile, while all of that is happening,
Meanwhile, at the Batcave.
Large parts of southern Vietnam are still being occupied by the French, including in the city of Saigon itself, the traditional capital of Vietnam. And violence between French troops and nationalists are on the rise. Also, in 1946, the Viet Minh worked alongside French troops in order to kill anti-communist nationalists.
Wow.
And also to kill Trotskyists.
Wow.
And so Trotskyists who are in the Viet Minh, who are communists in the Viet Minh, but they don't toe Stalin's line. They're not Marxist-Leninists. They are Trotskyists, and Trotsky is a dirty, vile traitor to the revolution, as we all know. So they had to purge their ranks. That always happens. Every single communist revolution in history. As soon as the Marxist-Leninists...
3 sips.
And every time there's a communist revolution in history, some of the first people that are always targeted in the purges that follow are Trotskyists, who in a lot of cases fought in that revolution for the communist cause. Which I'm only partially sad about, because Trotskyists are real fuckers. I hate those guys. Here's a story about the Trotskyists getting purged from the Viet Minh, which again was done in collaboration with French colonial troops. This is a story about when word of that purge got back to France while Ho Chi Minh was there, because Ho Chi Minh wasn't in the country while all of this was going on. So during some sort of another like diplomatic meeting, one of these conferences, a French communist walks up to Ho Chi Minh and like he introduces himself. They start talking, and he mentions, by the way, I just heard about your comrade, and mentions the name of like the leader of the communist faction, or the Trotskyist faction of the Viet Minh, who was like one of those guys, like who was like a long time like associate of Ho Chi Minh and was like revered as like a national hero alongside him. He was like a very well regarded throughout Vietnam, even amongst like non-communist people. And he was killed during these purges.
Damn.
And so he asked Ho Chi Minh, like, yeah, what's going on with that? That's a shame, isn't it? And without an ounce of emotion in his voice, Ho Chi Minh responds, yeah, he was a real patriot. And then later on, when they're talking and nobody's around, nobody else around, he leans in close to this French communist and he just says, completely dead-faced, with a dead serious voice, just says to him, yeah, what we did to that guy, that'll happen to anybody who doesn't toe my line.
Fuck.
And he specifically uses that phrase, my line. So Ho Chi Minh, he had the capacity to be a real bastard. Like regardless of the righteousness of his cause, or like any like
the morality of everything.
Yeah, he had a little Stalin in him. He learned some lessons. So eventually, after all of these purges, the communists have full control of the Viet Minh movement, and so by extension, full control over the Vietnamese state. And while that was happening, all of Ho Chi Minh's negotiations in France were turning into failure. It just wasn't working out. And as it was kind of finally starting to settle on Ho and all of his comrades in the party, that negotiation wasn't going to win Vietnam its independence, this thing happened in the coastal city of Haiphong. Some French sailors in the French Navy were just coming into port, because, it's still supposed to be like a French colony, so even though the French didn't technically have control of this vast city, they thought they could still just come in. So they come in, and while they're trying to like unload some like cargo or something, some locals start to open fire on them.
Fuck.
Because that's the French. That's the people that we're trying to be free from. Let's fucking kill them. And so a firefight breaks out that kills 23 French sailors.
Shit.
Later on, when the other French sailors are trying to conduct a funeral service for the sailors that died, the guys that are carrying out like the cemetery, like the burying duty, are ambushed, and 6 more of them are killed.
Fuck. They really like fuck the French.
Yeah, yeah. So this results in like a lot of over the next few days, a lot of pot shots start getting taken back and forth. A few firefights broke out. Eventually, more and more forces get involved on both sides until eventually you have full blown like battles going on in the streets, and people are starting to die on both sides. And eventually, there are like 4 French ships and docked in this harbor, and they decide, okay, fuck this. It's time to iron grip this thing. It's time to reassert our dominance over this colony. And so what do? They go out into the middle of the harbor. They turn all of the big guns on their decks towards the city, and they just start shelling it. They start dropping payloads that are designed to sink ironclads onto civilian neighborhoods and businesses. And after a few days of shelling, 6,000 civilians are dead. This comes to be called the Haiphong incident, or the shelling of Haiphong. And after hearing about this, after news of this reaches Ho Chi Minh in Paris, he decides, okay, diplomacy has failed, and now 6,000 of my people are dead from an artillery bombardment. It's time to take things up a notch. And so he returns to Vietnam, and on December 19th, 1946, he declares war on France. And the Indochina War begins. This war is a mess. It is a fucking mess. Imagine what all of your stereotypes about the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Now imagine that, but everybody is way less well supplied.
Damn.
And half the time they're resorting to having to hack each other to death with machetes.
Fuck.
There are most of the Viet Minh forces at this point. If they're lucky, they'll be armed with like looted Japanese weaponry, like the Arasakas and Type 99s. That's if they're lucky. Most of the time, they don't have ammunition for that. Most of them, if they have firearms, are using like old muskets from like the 1800s, because they can at least like make some cheap ammunition for those. And so whenever they do their hit or run attacks, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll fire one shot from their muskets, they'll run up, hack a couple people to death with their machetes, and then book it.
Fuck, that sounds bloody as shit.
Yeah. The Viet Minh, they start conducting hit and run attacks on French military patrols. They start bombing infrastructure. There's this one really common. So the only way that they really have to deal with tanks, because they don't have anti-armor penetrating weaponry. They just don't. It doesn't exist in Vietnam. So the only way that they have to deal with French tanks is they will take like hollowed out or like mortar rounds with like the primers like hollowed out, the primers at the tip that detonate it, and they'll attach their own trigger fuse to a stick, and then they will run up to the tank and just smack the tank as hard as they can while they're holding this detonator, smack the side of it, and blow themselves up, hoping that the explosion will punch a hole through the side of the tank. That is their most common form of like anti-tank weaponry, because that's all they had. Sometimes they were able to use Molotovs, but that didn't always work. And this is the kind of fighting that they're doing. So they will move in, they will destroy all of the French army's infrastructure, and then on their way out, like half of their force will be murdered by machine guns. It is a bloodbath. Thousands are dying on both sides. And this war just drags on and on and on for 9 years.
Fuck.
So, in 1949, the French organized a puppet government in Saigon, in South Vietnam, that came to be called the State of Vietnam. Later, it would be called the Republic of Vietnam.
Okay.
This is where the official political division between North and South Vietnam becomes a thing. It's why later on during the Vietnam War, the United States is working alongside South Vietnam and fighting North Vietnam.
Gotcha.
And so now that it's become a civil war, now you have Vietnamese soldiers fighting for the French. And so all of the messy stuff that goes along with civil wars suddenly enters into the picture. And so the Viet Minh, both the French and the Viet Minh, are responsible for a lot of civilian massacres. The Viet Minh are estimated to have killed somewhere between like 100 and 150,000 civilians. And the French are responsible for, the low numbers for the French are 60,000. Nobody takes those seriously because those numbers come from people who are very vocally supportive of French colonialism. The good accurate numbers are somewhere between 200 and 250,000 civilians.
Shit.
And you know what's crazy is, compared to like the later Vietnam War that the U.S. is involved in, those are kind of small numbers.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're right. I hate to call that many people dying small, but
Yeah, it's a nightmare. It's a nightmare.
modern war is just a nightmare.
So this war dragged on for years. But eventually the North started to get the upper hand for a variety of reasons. The Viet Minh were well trained, they were well veteraned. They were fighting for a strong cause that they believed in on their own home turf. All of these are very important factors for the combat effectiveness of a force. And on the other side, the French weren't what they used to be. They really weren't. Their colonial administration was very weak. Their military was very weak after, the whole Nazi occupation thing. And the brutal reality of it was nobody involved in the army or back at home in France really cared about Vietnam or Indochina.
Fuck.
Like to most people, it was kind of a matter of prestige to stay in Indochina. It was national prestige. It was a lot of people in France wanted to kind of scrape back some dignity after the indignity that was France during World War II, which is really unfair because the French did their government was, weak and tipped over like a sick cow, but the French people did some very admirable stuff during the war. Like the French resistance is famous for the heroism. Like they had a lot of stuff to be proud of, but so many of them just really wanted to keep just a vestige of that old colonial glory. They wanted to keep it so bad. It's the last bit of honor and like dignity and greatness that the old France before the occupation really had. And so that's why they stuck around. They weren't. It was never going to be profitable as a colony again. It was never going to be worth the lives or the manpower to keep. It was just about ego.
Yeah, that's how a lot of that shit was fought.
Yeah, and for that, 500,000 people died.
Of course they did.
And that's the problem is though, ego can only take you so far. At some point, when you're getting your son's body back in a coffin, ego doesn't matter much anymore. And that is a lesson that Ho Chi Minh and the communists in North Vietnam are going to keep, and they're going to learn from, and they're going to apply very effectively in the future.
I bet.
By 1950, the Chinese communists, the communists in China, they'd won their civil war. They'd kicked Chiang Kai-shek out, and they had formed the People's Republic of China. And so now North Vietnam had a strong communist potential ally on their northern border. The only problem was, at some point during this conflict, the French had moved troops and invaded like the northernmost section of North Vietnam, right along the border with China. And so they were blockading anything from getting through China into North Vietnam. And that was until 1950, when the guerrillas were successfully able to push the French forces out of that border area. And so all of a sudden they started getting an influx of like modern weaponry. They go from muskets and machetes to mostly like bolt action rifles. They're mostly dealing with like World War II bolt action rifles, but a lot of them are getting stuff from the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union has just started using the AK-47.
Okay.
And that's when you get the first AK-47s being used like widespread in the Vietnam conflict.
Damn.
And assault rifles, as it turns out, because the French army is still using, they have a limited run of like their own like sort of semi-assault rifles that are more kind of submachine guns, but most of their troops are still using like old bolt actions. And so all of a sudden, not only are they fighting like a really effective, well-trained guerrilla force, some of them have assault rifles against like the shit that their grandparents were using in the trenches of World War One.
Fuck.
Suddenly, they find themselves kind of outmatched technologically. I mean, they still have some tanks, for what that's worth, but also they're getting recoilless rifles from the Soviet Union too. Those can punch through like 4 or 6 inches of steel plate, no problem.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, 1950, the French forces go on the back foot. They start to panic. And as an ominous portent of things to come, this is when we start to see the first American troops appear in Vietnam. Now, this isn't a full military commitment at this point. These are military advisors. And later on in 1956 is where we're going to see the first American casualty in Vietnam. I didn't put it down. I forgot his name. I got it right here, though. Yeah, the very first American killed in the conflict in Vietnam was Technical Sergeant Richard Fitzgibbon Jr. of the United States Air Force, killed June 8th, 1956.
Damn.
Yeah, and this is when there are probably like 400 or 500 American servicemen in Vietnam at the time. And literally all they're doing is they're either flying planes for supplies, flying planes, or they are like military advisors to the French army. So the beginning of the end of this conflict would finally come in 1954. And oh my God, you are going to love this story. The way that this war begins is so...
Oh, really?
This is legitimately one of my favorite stories from all of history, is the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. This, oh my God. Okay. The French launched an offensive through Laos, which was still a French protectorate. The nation of Laos, which it borders on the northwest border of Vietnam. The goal was to cut off the Viet Minh from supplies coming in from the northern border. They wanted to come in and try to reassert that blockade. And they also wanted to put pressure on the capital of Hanoi at the same time. And the goal of this was not actually to cut off the supplies or capture Hanoi itself. The goal was to bait the Viet Minh forces into an open engagement. Because they knew that a guerrilla army works their worst case scenario is trying to fight in a pitched battle. If they're not able to do hit and run tactics and sabotage, they don't always do the best, because that's not what they're trained to, and that's not what they're good at. This operation that the French launched was in the middle of the jungle, completely disconnected from supply lines. And so they planned to resupply by just building like small makeshift airstrips as they went, so that the planes could fly in and just drop some new stuff off, which worked pretty decently. They had some really good pilots. There were a lot of Americans involved in like this airlift, and America at that time had probably the best pilots on the planet. So and they thought that this would be fine. Normally, in most scenarios, this would be a horrible idea, because by this point, humanity had invented this thing called flak munitions, and had put them into these things called anti-aircraft barrages. So normally, it's a bad idea to try to put all of your supply on the backs of aircraft, because aircraft can be shot out of the sky. But they thought this would be fine because, hey, there's a guerrilla insurgency. They don't have anti-aircraft guns. They don't have that. They can't do that. So the Viet Minh had anti-aircraft guns. And so the French forces settled in this valley, surrounded like high in the hill country in northern Vietnam, surrounded by like these small mountains on all sides. It's this gentle sloping valley in the middle of a small mountain range. And they settled down and set up camp right next to a little village called Dien Bien Phu, which was near the border of Laos. And while they were encamped, they came under attack by Viet Minh guerrillas. They started getting ambushed and started getting like harassed. And every time they tried to relocate or change direction, go to a different place, they would be like tactically like corralled back into the valley. Like the Viet Minh would selectively pick where they attacked to kind of herd them like sheep back into the valley. They were really good at this. But the French, they figured that this was fine because if we're in the valley, like there's not a whole lot of like directions that they could be coming from because it's all mountainous and rocky, and there's only like narrow pathways through the hills that they could come through. So we can just kind of bunker down here, set up some defenses, and we'll just keep getting supplies in through our airlifts, and they can just keep throwing bodies at us, and we'll be fine. This is what they wanted all along. That was their plan, was to bait them into attacking. They weren't counting on in any other situation, any like even moderately competent, like even the most incompetent general could look at this situation and tell you, oh yeah, this is a kill box. If the enemy sees us, they'll just bring their artillery and just shoot it right into us. There's nothing we can do about it. The problem is we're dealing with the French here. And the French are under the mistaken impression, that the Vietnamese are not capable of using artillery. And it's not just racism, though that was a big part of it. But
I was literally about to say, is this another racism?
That was a heavy part. A lot of the French's planning during the Indochina War was predicated on assumptions that they made about the Vietnamese people and their intelligence that just weren't true. And this is one of those situations, though the main thing was they figured that the jungle around these hills that's surrounding us is too dense. They can't tow artillery up to the top to fire them down on us, and they're too tall to sit at the bottom, and there's not enough range for the artillery to round the shells to arc over the mountain.
Okay.
So they figured there's no way that they can actually shell us in here. So if we could just bunker down here, if all they could do is like come at us with guns, and we can hold that off, that's fine. So the Vietnamese, it was indeed true. They could not tow the artillery up the mountains. You know what they could do, though?
What could they do?
They could take the artillery apart into its basic pieces and then carry those up individually, one by one.
Damn.
And then reassemble them like Legos at the top.
That's one way to do it, for sure.
I love this story so much. So that's exactly what they did. Not just like howitzers, like artillery, but also anti-aircraft guns. They carried them all the way up to the top of the mountains, and just their individual component pieces, and then individually carried all of their ammunition up to the top too. And they did this all under the cover of night in complete silence for 54 days straight, until they got everything into position. And then they pointed them right down to the valley, and the next morning, as the sun was coming up, they just opened fire. And within like 12 hours, the entire middle of the entire valley was, it looked like no man's land in World War II. It was just a pockmarked, muddy hellhole. Like all of the French tents were destroyed, were just blown to bits. All of their supply hubs, all of their supply piles, all of their vehicles, their landing strip that they had made so that their planes could come and resupply them, those were all destroyed.
Jeez.
Any planes that did try to come by to land, those anti-aircraft guns opened up on them. Most of them turned around and fled. Some of them got caught up in the flak and were shot down.
Wow.
To the French army's credit, they did hold out with this for about 2 months.
Wow.
And it took several successive frontal assaults by the Viet Minh foot soldiers to be able to finally force their surrender.
Jeez.
So by the end of the fighting, 2,000 French troops were dead and 11,000 were taken prisoner. Those 13 or 14,000 troops were about 10% of the entire French army in Indochina. And my favorite part of the story, just the real like cherry on the top of this whole story. The bulk of the guys, the French soldiers, were not actually French. The bulk of the French troops fighting here were members of the French Foreign Legion.
Damn.
Do you know anything about the French Foreign Legion immediately after World War II?
No, I do not.
A very sizable chunk of the Foreign Legion were former members of the SS.
Wow.
They were former members of the Nazis, and they were the guys that were captured during like the final pushes into Germany when there were French resistance troops that were kind of helping like in the push into Germany. And whenever they'd be captured by French authorities, they would basically be imprisoned, and then they'd be brought before a magistrate in France and basically told, "We've caught you in this SS uniform. We have a record of all of the crimes that you committed in our country, all of the innocent people that you either murdered in cold blood or shipped off to camps. So we're going to give you one of two choices. Either you can come and fight for France in the Foreign Legion, you can get a new name and you can get French citizenship, and you can shut the fuck up about your background and never be a Nazi again, or we'll just take you out back and kill you." And so with that, most of the French Foreign Legion were former Nazis.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
And so a not insignificant chunk of the guys that were killed during the Battle of Dien Bien Phu were Nazis.
No great loss.
It's just cherry on top. Cherry. Oh, fuck. I love that story. So.
That's actually a saying from in Stephen King's The Stand. He kind of goes over a bunch of people like not reacting well to the end of the world, basically via virus, and like after a couple people die, each death, no great loss or something like that.
So after this defeat is so bad that the entire nation of France, when they find out, just goes into like a week of mourning. Like people cancel like public.
Damn. Talk about an L.
Yeah, they cancel public events. They close up shops. They play like sad funeral music on the radio. It's fucking dumb.
It's hilarious.
So the French, after this defeat, they petitioned the North Vietnamese government to negotiate, and on May 8th, 1954, negotiations began in Geneva, Switzerland, for France's withdrawal from Indochina. The final terms were settled in 1956, and the final terms stipulated that the country was to be split in half along the 17th parallel. The North would be controlled by the Communist Viet Minh. The South would be controlled by the former French collaborators, like the Catholic middle class people we were talking about before.
Okay.
Which it's a little. I don't know if this will shock you or not, but a lot of the people that ruled over South Vietnam, they were very unpopular in large part, not just because they were Catholic and fought alongside the French, but also because they collaborated with the Japanese government too.
Sounds about right.
I'm not a fan of like authoritarian communists or communist states. I never have been. I don't like them. Not a big fan.
I can imagine it's pretty reasonable not to like them.
Yeah, it's a reasonable. The South Vietnamese government were actual psychos. Like, just the biggest bunch of fucking freaks that have ever lived. I'll get in a little bit more in just a second. But so, yeah, that was the first stipulation. Divided along the 17th parallel, communists controlled the North, Republic of Vietnam controlled the South. It was also decided that both the North and the South were going to hold elections for a reunification government. So basically, the UN would help create a new government for unified Vietnam, and then would oversee the elections throughout both halves of the country to elect delegates to this new Congress, so that it would be as smooth a reunification as possible. While these negotiations were going on, the now freed up North Vietnamese government were starting to institute sweeping reforms across their country. And when a Marxist government enacts sweeping reforms, a lot of people die.
As one can imagine.
Yeah, and not just Not just people like, don't get me wrong, what happens next? A lot of landlords die, which, mixed bag. It's not good when a lot of people die, but I get it. The problem is, when you kill all of the landlords and redistribute their land,
People get angry, unfortunately.
well, some people get angry, but a lot more people are happy because they hate their landlords. And also, look at all this land I'm getting. Wow, this is the richest my family's been in like 80 generations. I get my own land? I'm never going to starve again. I don't have to give any of my food to my landlord anymore. I don't have to pay rent. This is great. This is awesome. And then they realize that they don't have the infrastructure for individual plots or collective plots to actually be farmed effectively. All the infrastructure was set up for like this sort of feudal transactionary rental system. And so a lot of crops start going unplanted, and a lot of people start to starve the following season because they don't have enough food.
Yeah.
And so Ho Chi Minh himself was forced to step in and be like, "Hey, let's dial this back up a little bit." And he himself comes out against the wishes of his own party, and basically comes out and tells the Vietnamese people, like,
Hey, we fucked up.
we fucked this up pretty bad, and we're sorry about this. So we're gonna roll this back, and we're gonna find something that works a little better. Just bear with us. And all the Vietnamese people were like, "Oh God, we love you so much. Thank you, Uncle Ho. This was amazing. Thank you so much." So anyways, that's what's going on back in Vietnam. Back in Geneva, Switzerland. So basically, those reunification elections that had been promised in like the French like leaving deal, they never materialized. In part because the communists, the Viet Minh were really bad about like they had some stipulations they really wanted to get through about the election process, and they were very uncompromising about it. And then the other thing was the United States were not stupid. They could see that everybody in Vietnam hated the South Vietnamese government, and they loved Ho Chi Minh. The South were collaborators. The North were the freedom fighters.
Damn.
The South were the Benedict Arnolds. The North were the George Washingtons. They knew if there was an election, like a fair election in Vietnam, the communists would sweep. They would dominate. It would be a complete wash. There would be no debate. And the United States couldn't allow that because they just got into this thing called domino theory, which was this theory that if they allowed one country to fall to communism in a region, eventually every country in that region would fall to communism. And they cited the fact that after the Soviet Union fell, suddenly you had communist revolutions pop up in Germany, in right after World War I, and then you had communist revolutionaries popping up in China, which was just on the other side bordering Russia, a little bit later down the line. And then once China won, then all of a sudden Vietnam was getting their communist takeover. So they were scared that this would just keep dominoing.
It's going to domino effect.
And that maybe eventually, well, if Vietnam falls, then Cambodia falls. And if Cambodia falls, then Burma falls. If Burma falls, then India might fall. Yeah, and if India falls, then Australia might fall. And that's a white country. We can't let that happen.
Well, of course not.
So yeah, they were never going to allow Vietnam to become communist democratically. And so after several years, and the Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh and his guys realizing that, this is never going to happen. We're never going to do this peacefully. Eventually, they start drawing up plans to begin to undermine the South's combat readiness, because they know that the gunshots are starting soon. It's a matter of time at this point. And then all of a sudden, around that time, pro-communist guerrillas that are unaffiliated with the Viet Minh start popping up in South Vietnam. And they're very well trained and very well organized because, I say unaffiliated. They weren't organized by the Viet Minh. A lot of them fought with the Viet Minh. But the Viet Minh had no hand in their creation. they sprouted up organically and started fighting the South Vietnam government. And these guerrillas, they fought under the name of the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam.
Gotcha.
A little catchier, in Vietnamese, their shortened name is the Viet Cong. Yeah, this is where the Viet Cong comes from. And Ho and his guys, they look at that and they're like, this is it. This is our ticket. These guys are already doing really well. They got a lot of public support. All we need to do is make sure they keep getting gun training. If we could keep that up, South Vietnam might just fall by themselves. And so they set up like this network of secret supply depots where they could transport goods from North Vietnam secretly through Laos and through Cambodia into South Vietnam, where they could hand it off to the Viet Cong guerrillas. And this network came to be called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And the Ho Chi Minh Trail was the linchpin of their entire strategy to defeating South Vietnam. As long as they could keep the food, the bullets, the guns, the training, the money, everything getting to the Viet Cong to keep the pressure on South Vietnam, eventually they would get their opportunity and they'd be able to strike and win decisively. As all of this is happening, this is 1960. Ho Chi Minh is now 70 years old.
Fuck.
Yeah, when I was doing my research, I had forgotten how long it had been in this story. I was still thinking he was in like his 40s. That's how I imagined him. And then it got to this point where we're gearing up to start the actual Vietnam War. And it points out that 1960, he's got arthritis. He's walking around with a cane now. He's got white hair, wrinkles. He's got on and off tuberculosis. He's really scared for his health. He's got a developing heart condition. He's becoming like an old man.
Yeah, I can imagine at that point.
He is an old man. He's been through a lot of shit. He's tired. He still has a lot of work he wants to do, but he doesn't have the energy for it anymore. And so he goes ahead and he decides that if war does break out again, he's probably not the best person to lead anymore. And so he decides...
Is this where he steps down?
He partially steps down. He steps down from leadership as chairman of the Communist Party, which is, in a one-party state, that's who's in charge. He stays the president, but the president is kind of a secondary role to the chair. So he lets somebody younger rise up rise up to take his position, and he becomes not a figurehead. He's still very influential, but he's kind of on the sidelines of Vietnamese politics at this point, kind of influencing it indirectly rather than giving direct orders. So there was a chance, there was a possibility this whole war could have been avoided.
Wow.
And it could have been avoided with the help of the French, ironically enough. There were French diplomats who were coming in and completely earnestly were like, yeah, we've got some plans drawn up. We could help you organize like a convention, a conference with the North and the South, where you could hammer out this plan to not completely reunify, but form a sort of like federation. Like a federation of two nations, where you'd each be semi-independent, but you both work together through a single governing entity, a single like confederal government.
So kind of like how the United States originally started off as.
Yeah, a little like that. This sort of confederal government would have a little bit more teeth to it. It'd have a little bit more authority. It wouldn't just like be a useless like old man's daycare, but like the Articles of Confederation were. But it would still be like two like essentially like states within like a larger federated country, the United States of Vietnam, if you will. And this had like moderate support. Like even Ho Chi Minh was like, yeah, this is a good idea. This is a good opportunity. And there were people in the South Vietnamese government that were also sympathetic to that. At this point, the guys who are in charge of South Vietnam, they're complete psychos, but a few of them were at least like practical about it. The guys who would come later were way worse. But at this point, they at least had the good sense to be like, yeah, war probably wouldn't be in anybody's best interest. This is a good idea. The problem was South Vietnam was heavily reliant on the U.S. military to keep it propped up. It couldn't exist and survive on its own. It required both U.S. military presence and military supplies. And so the U.S. could basically dictate what South Vietnam did. It was basically be like, yeah, if you don't do this, 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 and this, we'll just stop sending you guns. Which a crafty statesman would have pushed back and leveraged it the other way. And well, if you don't send us guns, then I guess we'll just go and join the communists. You wouldn't want that, would you? You better keep... if any of them were at all competent, that's what they would have done.
But they didn't.
They kind of liked being under the United States thumb. It reminded them a lot of the French. They're daddy French. They have good memories of France.
France, senpai.
Their childhood with France. They needed that strong authority figure to just rock them to sleep, little babies. So that was a major thing. A lot of forces within the South Vietnamese government were constantly trying to hamstring these discussions. Another thing was that during that time, the Catholics within the Southern Vietnamese government were carrying out anti-Buddhist purges, and a lot of Buddhists in the, especially in the countryside, a lot of them were communist sympathizers, were just being rounded up and shot. Thousands,
as tends to happen.
With 3 zeros at the end. Thousands. So yeah, that kind of soured a lot of the discussions. And so those plans fell apart. Then in 1963, some crazy shit happened. So
what is the crazy shit that had happened?
The president of South Vietnam, who, fun fact, actually went to college with Ho Chi Minh. They were classmates.
Damn.
He was overthrown in a coup and assassinated.
Fuck.
And he was the only reasonable person in the whole government. Because this is so funny, he had this crazy theory that if he set up his government with all of these interlocking and overlapping ministries, that he gave overlapping fields of jurisdiction. So you'd have one department that would be over a certain kind of thing within the government, but then you have another department that would also be involved with some of those things but not with others, and then they'd be involved with some things but not others with another department, and they're all overlapping.
Fun.
And so they were all constantly fighting against one another.
But of course.
And it made his government really inefficient, but it also, he thought it would guarantee that if they were constantly fighting against one another, all the different factions in his government, then no single one would be able to turn their attention to him, to knock him out and take power for themselves.
I mean, theoretically, yes, but eventually, no.
Yeah. So they were never able to take power from him, but they were able to kill him. And then once he was gone, all of that infighting just boiled over, and the entire government fell apart. The South Vietnamese government essentially ceased to exist. And as soon as this happened, law and order broke down in the city. Saigon was in full panic mode. Riots filled the streets. The police completely lost control. The military were going AWOL and firing into crowds. Some of them were defecting. Some of them were just going AWOL and running, going back home. And then out in the countryside, these really well-trained, well-armed, well-organized communists in the Viet Cong were able to come in and fill the power vacuum, and all of a sudden they became the most powerful and legitimate, essentially, government in all of South Vietnam.
Damn.
This close. They were this close to reuniting the country without war. And it was almost entirely due to the incompetence of the South Vietnamese government.
Yeah, that's typically how things go, unfortunately.
But unfortunately, our good president, Lyndon B. Johnson, was unable to accept this turn of events.
Because good old Johnson could never have accepted that shit just fucks up sometimes.
Yeah, and so Big Dick Johnson decided that he put it off for about a year. He waited about a year to actually send troops into Vietnam, because this happened in 1963. But that was, the next year was an election year, and he wanted to secure his re-election before he committed troops.
But of course.
Because he knew that committing troops would be unpopular and would hurt his numbers. So he waited until after he won re-election, and then he sent 60,000 troops to South Vietnam. And this is how the Vietnam War began.
In my opinion, that was cowardly of Lyndon B. Johnson.
Yeah. I'm not going to get into the gritty details of the Vietnam War. We're all kind of familiar with what happened.
It doesn't really feel like it's super relevant to our character anyway.
Yeah, at this point, he's a little on the sidelines. He's more of like a symbolic figure in Vietnam at this point, but he is still alive and influencing things, and he's still around. And I'm about to talk about kind of like what he's seen during all this and how he's responding to it. So I'm not going to cover like the gritty details of the war. I am going to cover the broad strokes, specifically from the perspective of the North Vietnamese government. So yeah, this opportunity, or this whole situation, it was bad. It very quickly, it turned out to actually potentially be really bad for North Vietnam, because all of a sudden, the firepower of the United States Army, the United States military, was reinforcing South Vietnamese law and order, and they had started to drive a lot of sections of the Viet Cong back into the jungles. At the same time that's happening, they're launching a massive, insane, huge bombing campaign on North Vietnam. Within a couple months, over half of all of the infrastructure, that includes communications, roads, rail lines, even like just buildings, like a good chunk of just the standing buildings in northern Vietnam are leveled, destroyed, made inoperable. They no longer work. And that's really, really bad because, well, for one thing, they need that for society to exist. And for another thing, they need to keep the supplies going to the Viet Cong in order to keep this whole thing going. If they stop that, South Vietnam falls. And after that, all their attention from South Vietnam and the United States turns on the North. And so Vietnam goes into full total war mode. Their entire political system and their entire culture and their entire economy is redirected towards war. Hundreds of thousands of North Vietnamese citizens are drafted into the North Vietnamese army. Anybody who isn't drafted is redirected and guided to begin work on like infrastructure projects, because their hope is that if they can mobilize the entire civilian population to working on building infrastructure, they can build it faster than the U.S. Air Force can destroy it. And at the same time, they are having to go to China to keep a constant supply of guns and money and stuff coming into Vietnam. And a lot of, they fought a war for independence. They don't like relying on outside like other nations for their own protection. The Vietnam War has begun.
Gotcha.
Creedence Clearwater Revival is playing in the background. The sounds of Huey chopper blades are filling the... North Vietnam's gone into total war. They're being bombed to shit by the U.S. Air Force. So everything's a full swing. Shit's at the fan. Once the bombings start, North Vietnam is like, oh shit. This is bad. This is pretty bad. Let's go ahead and try to negotiate. We still have the tactical upper hand here because we control the Viet Cong control like 90% of the South. So like we could still pull this out. We have the upper hand at the bargaining table at this point. So let's try to negotiate. And another thing, besides the bombings, there were rumors that the United States, everybody knew about the Ho Chi Minh Trail, even though nobody really tried to do anything about it. The U.S. knew about the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They really wanted to do something about it. And they knew, and the North knew that the U.S. was eventually going to try and invade Laos and Cambodia to try to take care of that. So they wanted to make peace before the Ho Chi Minh Trail was cut off, because that would be the death nail for the Viet Cong. They wouldn't be able to keep their gains if that happened.
Makes sense.
The problem was nobody, first it was Lyndon Johnson, who was a maniac. Later on, it would be Nixon, who's also a maniac. Behind both of them is this guy you've probably heard of, Henry Kissinger.
Yeah, I've heard of Kissinger.
Yeah, a little fella named Henry Kissinger who's advising every president during this period of time, and basically saying, no, we don't have to, we don't negotiate with these people. That'll just embolden them. That's how you get. But yeah, Kissinger, he wasn't a general or anything. He wasn't even really like in the government at all. He was a professor of like, he was like a poli-sci professor at Harvard or something. And he wrote like a book or an essay in the 50s about like containing communism, and ended up getting brought in as like a foreign policy expert by every administration from Eisenhower all the way through like Reagan. And he was 100% no negotiation, no sit down, only unconditional surrender. And the way we force unconditional surrender is by bombing everything that moves. His ideas and his plans are probably what single-handedly contributed to the most deaths in the Vietnam War.
Sounds like it.
Which was a direct result. It was a direct result of American bombings. What it did in Vietnam was really bad. They dropped more bombs on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia together in 1 year of the war than all of the bombs dropped during World War I and World War II.
Fuck!
Combined.
Fuck!
That was just 1 year. This lasted for 11 years.
That's fucking insane.
Yeah. So whenever North Vietnam tried to negotiate ceasefires repeatedly to stop the war, and every single time Kissinger was the main voice talking in the presidency ear, being like, no, we can't do that. We can't do that.
Nah, fuck these people.
And then later on.
That's basically what Kissinger was saying.
Yeah, and then later on near the end of the war, when the United States was finally deciding to withdraw troops from Vietnam, and they were negotiating with the North for that withdrawal, he was the guy who was like the lead in the negotiations for the American side. And so for negotiating that, he received the Nobel Peace Prize.
Fuck him.
Fuck the Nobel Prize Committee. Fuck those assholes.
That's bullshit.
Absolute horseshit. That's why I don't take the Nobel Peace Prize seriously anymore.
Oh no, it very rarely is actually awarded to someone who should probably actually get the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah. For the fact that they gave it to Kissinger and to Obama. The fact that they gave it to Obama too. Fucking travesties. Fucking actually. Didn't
Obama drop a fucking fuckload of bombs on places in his presidency? Drones, bombs, whatever.
Yeah. Barack Obama dropped more bombs during his presidency than George W. Bush did, and he's the one who started the wars.
Fuck.
So yeah, the United States is not negotiating. So the North government decides to change tact, and they decide, well, if we're not able to negotiate to end this war, then we need to, because they're looking at the situation objectively. They might be fighting on home turf, and they might be really effective guerrilla fighters, and the Viet Cong might be really effective guerrilla fighters. The United States military is the United States military. You don't beat them one-on-one.
Well, duh, yeah. You don't fuck with the U.S. military.
Yeah, you don't beat them like mano a mano. They win every time.
The U.S. military is a big dick in a locker room.
Yeah. So they decided to play it a different way. And here's the great irony, is that what they're about to do was heavily inspired by, part of the idea was partially inspired by stuff that, like, Ho Chi Minh himself, he was involved in like the planning for this, and he kind of helped come up with this idea to basically what they were going to do is they were going to launch one big offensive that would hit the Americans really hard, really fast, and knock them off balance. And once they did that, that would break their resolve, not completely. They knew that they couldn't break them completely, but just enough that it could cause cracks in public support back home for the war effort. And if they could do that, then after that initial offensive, all they would have to do was hold out and cause as many casualties as possible. Because eventually, the public public support for the war back in the United States would falter.
Well, of course.
It couldn't last forever. It's what they did with the French, but this time they were playing brinksmanship with the United States and forgot how bloodthirsty the U.S. is. Well, no, because they actually, like, their instincts were 100% on the ball. Their plan worked to a T, because that is exactly what ended up happening. That is why Ho Chi Minh and his generals indirectly masterminded the anti-war movement in the United States.
Damn.
And the great irony is that Ho Chi Minh got this idea from George Washington.
Fuck yes.
Because this is the tactic that...
So you're saying he pulled this tactic off because he was an Americaboo?
Yes. Because this is what, after the fall of New York City and Washington's retreat from New York into Pennsylvania, where he set up for Valley Forge, this is the idea that Washington came up with to fight the British. One big, dramatic offensive. Whether it worked or not, just hit them hard, and then after that, hold on.
Hit them fast.
Yeah, hit them hard, hit them fast, deal a lot of damage, and then after that, just hold on. And eventually they'd bleed themselves dry, and they'd get tired of it, and everybody at home would get tired of it, and it wouldn't be worth it anymore. And that won the American Revolution, and that won the communists the Vietnam War.
Fuck yes. Use our own tactics against us. I love it.
And so Ho Chi Minh was really excited about these plans because he thought this was the quickest way to end the war. And not only did he obviously he wanted the bloodshed to die. He didn't want to see his own people killed like this. Another part of it was that he's dying. He's sick. He's got, like, on and off tuberculosis. He's got a heart condition that's getting really bad. He doesn't have much time left. He wants to see Vietnam united before he goes. And so he signs off on this, and he directs them, and it begins on January 31st, 1968. The North Vietnamese army launches the Tet Offensive. And it's called the Tet Offensive because January 31st is, and going into February 1st, that is the Vietnamese New Year, which is called Tet.
Okay, that makes so much sense. Like, I had no idea where the Tet Offensive, like, the term came from.
Fun fact, one of the main targets for the North Vietnamese army was a city that was just on the south side of the 17th parallel, so right by the border with North Vietnam, where the United States had an air base, a city called Da Nang. During the Tet Offensive, my grandfather was working at that air base.
Wow.
Yeah, he was an aircraft mechanic for the Air Force, and he was on that air base. And I gotta tell you, a lot of really fucked up shit happened in Da Nang.
A lot of fucked up shit has happened at a lot of military bases.
Well, yeah, but specifically this, like, I can't... My grandfather never talked much about... He had a long career in the Air Force, and he was only in Vietnam for a year. But that year happened to be 1968, so that's
Yeah.
in Da Nang, right by the border, when the offensive happened. He never talked much about any of that. So
It's probably not a good place for him to visit in his mental memories.
yeah, but yeah, so it was a joint offensive. The Viet Cong and the NVA launched their attacks at the same time, and and the up to this point in the war. So it's been about 4 years at this point. Up to this point, despite not making much progress, the U.S. military was able to convincingly lie to the American press, basically saying, like, yeah, we've got the communists on the ropes. It's only a matter of time.
Because the U.S. does nothing better than lie to our face.
Once the video clips of the fighting and the obituaries make it into the newspapers, and the lists of casualties come back, and the stories of fighting from the wounded who come back to the United States, once those get out into the press, the U.S. government and the military can no longer lie. Nobody would believe them anymore. Nobody, because there's too many dead GIs coming back home in boxes to be able to spin this. It's not happening anymore.
Sometimes it's not spinnable, unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah, and so that's effectively the start of like widespread anti-war protest in the United States. That's when it becomes like mainstream to not support the war. And it would only that sentiment, that anti-war sentiment, will only keep growing and growing and growing until eventually public support for the war, even amongst like the most diehard anti-communists, would eventually just like dry up. Some people want to stay in the war, but even they recognize like it's not worth it anymore.
I mean, it really just feels like we were intruders in that war at that point, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah. By the time the U.S. withdraws from Vietnam, nearly 70,000 GIs are dead, and that's a lot of pine boxes that you can't paint over.
No, not at all.
It's a breaking point eventually, and so it worked. The North won. So yeah. So eventually, the North would win, but Ho Chi Minh wouldn't live to see that.
Damn.
He wouldn't live to see the end of the war.
That sucks.
He died of heart failure in his home in Hanoi on September 2nd, 1969.
I mean, at least a man died in his own home.
He put into his will that he wanted to be cremated.
I mean, I feel like I don't want to be buried in the ground to rot.
Well, they did something worse. They gave him the Lenin treatment.
Oh, fuck. What's the Lenin treatment?
They embalmed his body, put it in an airtight glass casket, and put him on display.
Oh, fuck!
Yeah. Did you know you can actually? So you can go see. You can go see the bodies of Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, and Vladimir Lenin. You can see their actual bodies. They're all on display.
What? Why would you want to go see someone's actual fucking corpse?
To a lot of communists, it's like like in the Middle Ages, like the saints were venerated by like taking a body part and like worshiping it as like a relic.
I'm familiar with the concept.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. They worship, a lot of communists worship these guys.
That's still fucked. I'm going to have it as part of my will that nothing happens to my estate until I'm cremated, assuming I have an estate to fucking care about.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, you can still go see Ho Chi Minh today if you want. You can go visit his mausoleum. He's still there. Yeah, it's really weird.
It's really fucked, is what it is.
Yeah, they've elevated just these normal these normal guys who happen to be like good leaders for their movements in their time, and in death have uplifted them to the status of like venerated relics.
The borderline saints.
Which is, a little, in my mind, it's a little contradictory to Marxist materialism in my as I understand materialism, that seems kind of contrary to the whole like brotherhood of mankind, all worker, like the equality and brotherhood of the international worker. That whole
That feels like completely like you're right. It's 1000% contradictory. I don't like it whatsoever.
yeah. Also, fun fact. I don't know why I just remembered this. A few years ago, some guy tried to break into the airtight glass casket that Mao Zedong was kept in.
But of course,
He hopped the ropes and tried to break it open because he wanted to be the last person to ever touch Mao Zedong with his dick.
what?
He wanted to touch the body of Mao Zedong with his dick.
What kind of pervert? I think you just broke my brain.
It's been a couple years since I checked up on him, but I think he's still in jail.
I would fucking hope so. Putting your dick on a fucking corpse.
Not just a fucking corpse, the corpse of like one of the most famous national leaders in human history. After his death, eventually after millions of deaths, about 4 million Vietnamese people died during this war.
Fucking Christ.
Yeah, the public outrage at this useless war back home in the U.S. forced the withdrawal of troops from Vietnam in 1974. Without American support, South Vietnam was quickly overrun. North Vietnamese troops entered Saigon on April 30th, 1975. As they entered the city, tanks had signs hung on their sides with the words, "You are still marching with us, Uncle Ho."
Damn.
And then the day after that, May 1st, 1975, the Battle of Saigon ended and Vietnam was officially reunified. Saigon would later be renamed Ho Chi Minh City.
That's why they renamed Saigon. Okay, that makes sense. I still, every once in a while, when I hear Saigon, I'll get that song, I'm Still in Saigon, stuck into my head.
Every time I hear Saigon, I think of that post on Twitter I saw once where somebody was like triggering a chuddy Vietnam vet's PTSD by holding up a map of Vietnam and screaming, "What is Saigon called? What is Saigon called?"
That's fucked up. It took me a second for that to hit how fucking insane / funny that is.
It's so bad, but it's so fun.
We're going to hell for laughing at that one.
For clarity, I don't support people harassing veterans, by the way. Please don't intentionally trigger anybody's stress responses. Please.
Please don't.
Even if they're a bad person, there are better ways to deal with that.
Kick them in the nuts and walk away.
Yeah, that's unironically, I'd prefer that to a trauma trigger.
Well, it's just nuts blows are usually considered a low blow, but I feel like using someone's trauma against them is a even more low blow. There's very few circumstances where I would be okay with us using someone's trauma against them intentionally.
Just running down the halls of a retirement home with a giant speaker blasting Fortunate Son with Huey Chopper Blade sound effects.
That's fucking horrible, Derek. And I'm literally picturing you doing it in my head right now.
Anyways.
You're just shouting, I speak for the trees, and some fucking reason they're speaking Vietnamese. Oh, I'm so going to hell for that one.
Whistling, standing in the middle of the jungle, whistling the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse theme, and all of a sudden you hear 8 other whistles coming from the trees.
Uh-oh.
Mickey Mouse, Mickey Mouse, Mickey Mouse.
Mickey Mouse.
So yeah, that's what I have. That's the story of Ho Chi Minh, the father of modern Vietnam.
Damn.
What are your thoughts? What are you thinking? It's the first time we've really touched deeply, like, I imagine eventually I'm going to do like a deeper dive into the Vietnam War itself. But this is kind of just the broad strokes. But
I didn't know there was so much history in that way is the best I can say it. Like a lot of US propaganda is like communism blah 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 and just kind of paints all this stuff as like the bad guys and the bad guys won in Vietnam kind of shit. And I'm just like, and to think there was a honest possibility that the war could have been averted and Vietnam was reunified would have been fucking insane.
yeah, there were, and this is the big thing, right? Like I've said it multiple times, I don't like authoritarian communism. I don't like authoritarian communists. I do openly refer to myself as a socialist, and I have my own ideas about what that means, and they don't include state communism. But there's a whole lot of death and destruction, especially in the 20th century, that really, really could have been avoided if it weren't for, because there are both communists and anti-communists and everywhere in between who can be reasonable, rational people who are able to just sit down and like talk about things at the very least. Because at some level, most people don't like the idea of mass death. They are opposed to that and will like to avoid it at any cost, regardless of your political views.
Yeah.
The problem was with so much of the 20th century, so many times, a lot of the decision making is being made by absolute maniacs, absolute nutcases.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And that is what caused the Korean War. That is what caused the Vietnam War. That is what caused the U.S. Invasion of Grenada, Desert Storm, Desert Shield, all the way up through the War on Terror that we just got through, the longest continuous conflict in American history. It's still happening. The same nutcases that prevented the mass death of 4 million people and the destruction of social cohesion in the United States as a result. Like they never went away. They just kept passing down their nutcase beliefs to the next generation.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's just where we are now. That's just our lives now. Is these same people still run everything? Oh, fuck.
Any last words before we wrap up our coverage of Ho Chi Minh?
Ho Chi Minh, I don't see him as either a hero or a villain. I see him as with all of our characters, a man with convictions and a man with flaws. And at some level, I do very much genuinely appreciate the struggle that he was fighting for. And I can appreciate on a very human level and have respect for like what it is that he was fighting for at the end of the day, regardless of either. And that's really what I can say best about him. Is he had his ups and downs, but man, Vietnam deserved to be free.
Oh yeah. Where can they find you on social medias?
They can find me on social media on Twitter at Visigoth. The first I is an I, the O is a 0. They can find me on Blue Sky. At Visigoth, the first I is an I, the O is a 0. Tim, give them the good stuff.
So they can find me both on Twitter and Blue Sky at Tim aka Otis, but they can also find the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at the Alexander Society Pod, on Twitter and Blue Sky at Alex Society Pod, and then on TikTok at Alexander Society. If they've enjoyed what they listen to, we hope you can give us a rate and review on your streaming platform of choice, and we will see you next time.
Bye-bye.